roles for Black women, and instead of giving up, you created them. You created a theater company. You created the roles. You made it happen.
That's right. And at a time when nobody was interested in us as black women, we were in our early 20s, we were the theatre school, drama school graduates. We realised there was no work for us out there. And so it made absolute sense for us to create our own theatre company, and we called it Theatre of Black Women. We were forging a theatrical identity for ourselves in a very racist society. I was quite a hothead. Myself and my friend Patricia, who was one of the co-founders of the theatre company, we used to go to theatre a lot. And as I said, the theatre was very white, and when it wasn't white, it was very male. And so if we objected to something on political grounds, we would heckle very loudly and disrupt shows, basically. And we would position ourselves at the back of the theatre so that we could make an easy escape. I grew out of that quite quickly. But when I do think about it, I am slightly outraged because I would never do that now. But if we found something offensive on political grounds, that was all we had at our disposal. You must remember, especially for younger audiences, that there was no social media, there was no Twitter, there was no internet. We had our voices, and that was it.
Your novel Girl, Woman, Other is so innovative in form and art and punctuation and groundbreaking in so many ways. It's 12 characters, 11 women, and one non binary character. How do you describe the book?
I call it a fusion fiction in terms of the form of it because it fuses different stories together and also the way I've used the language on the page. It is a book that is, in a way, an ode to Black British women, and it's a book that travels over well over 100 years, so that it's like a tapestry.
And then it won the Booker Prize in 2019, which is the pinnacle, of course, and something you'd hoped for as you write in your memoir, but it's hard to say it out loud. It's something that you had actually really said out loud to yourself, at least. You have said it wasn't an overnight success, obviously, but that everything changed overnight. So what changed?
Everything. So,
Yeah.
Girl, Woman, Other has sold well over 1 million copies in the English language alone. And compared to the sales of my previous books that were often critical successes, but they simply did not sell beyond a few thousand, the reach of my work has just exploded. And then how everybody saw me changed. The image of me as a writer literally changed overnight, and suddenly I was considered a heavyweight. And it's not that anybody thought I was a lightweight before, but I was often not included in the way that I wanted to be in terms of the literary culture here, and also I have a huge platform now that I didn't have before as an activist.
Well, there's a long tradition of political writers, from Aristotle to Ray Bradbury to Margaret Atwood, and their work is a form of activism and social conscience, and it's a part of history. How do you see your place in this part of ongoing history?
Yeah, I'm very aware that as I'm one of the very few Black British women novelists out there, I am writing our stories into history. I am redressing our absence, the absence of our stories in literature in Britain. And if it's not going to be in Britain, it's not going to be anywhere else either. So I'm very aware that I'm making history in the sense, not in an egotistical sense of, I'm so famous, so I'm going to make history, but that I am rewriting history and reimagining history through my work, but also as a writer doing what I do, I am also counteracting invisibility.
Do you remember the first time you thought of writing as a political act?
Probably the first poem I ever wrote was about the suffragettes. It was in a school magazine. I lost the school magazine. I went back to my old school last year and they dug it out of the archives and gave me a copy, and it was just wonderful to see it. And I thought, my God, Melody, you thought you became a feminist when you went to drama school, but this is such a feminist poem back then when I was 14.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is being a political writer different now than being one in previous generations?
The first thing to say is that all writing is political. Obviously, somebody like Margaret Atwood, grapples with the really big issues of the day and imagines our society in ways that are, really dystopian. For example, with Handmaid's Tale and Testaments. All writing is political. I think, no, when I go back to the writers who inspired me when I was a young woman, when I go back to Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Michelle Cliff, Audre Lorde, they were very political writers in America and writing black women's stories into being. That's what they were doing. And they were the first generation to do that in great numbers, actually, anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world.
I'd love to have our listeners learn about your Black Britain writing project. So these are writers who have been overlooked, forgotten, maybe never even known, and you're bringing them back to print. So the publishing business is a very complex and difficult business for many people, but what you're doing with this is really introducing a whole new canon of underrepresented writers into the public. I mean, it's really not an exaggeration to say some of these writers, maybe all of them, would be unknown without this project, and you're giving them a voice and you're giving them a life. Can you tell us a little bit about some of them? Who are you proudest of bringing back into print?
Yeah, so the project's called Black Britain Writing Back, and the idea is to bring back writers that were overlooked or have disappeared from view, going back over 100 years, actually. I think the two books that are sort of standout books in some ways are Growing Out, Black Hair and Black Pride in 60s Britain by somebody called Barbara Blake Hannah, which is an absolutely fantastic memoir about her time living in London in the 1960s. There's also A Black Boy at Eton by Dilibi Onyema, who was the first African, no, take it back, the first black person to graduate from Eton College, which is the most elite school in this country. It's about 1,300 years old, and I think it's probably the most famous school in the world. And he was a student there in the 60s. A couple of years after he left, he wrote a memoir about his time there. It was published in 1972, and it is brilliantly written, but also really shocking in terms of the racism he experienced at this super elite school. The headmaster of Eton banished him from ever darkening their doors again, and the book was kind of trashed by the media. Eventually, he went back to Nigeria, and we've now brought the book back. What I find so interesting about Delivy's book is that Eton College has produced 20 British Prime Ministers, including our current one. So it is really the seat of the establishment in this country. It is the hothouse of the elite in this country. And when you read about his treatment as a Nigerian boy at that school at that time, it really makes you reflect seriously on the nature of the people who then went on to run this country in all the kind of most important fields, in the last sort of 50 years or so, because they were the boys he was at school with.
How do you keep going? I mean, you say you're stubborn, and it totally comes through in your memoir that you are not going to give up. But you're experiencing throughout your life racism and ageism and misogyny. Is that what keeps you going, or what keeps you going?
Actually, what keeps me going is that I love what I do. That's a really good incentive, isn't it? I love creativity. I've led a creative life all my life. I love writing. Yes, sometimes it's frustrating and a bit struggling and might not work out for a while, but essentially, I love it. I don't know how I would function if I didn't have creative self expression in my life through my writing and creating other worlds and other stories, Because I'm not writing about myself most of all, I'm writing about these other imagined lives. I live in my imagination, and it's a wonderful place to be. It's very liberating and exciting and adventurous. And yeah, so that's what keeps me going. Yes, there are always obstacles, and definitely obstacles in my past. But if you're doing what you love and also enjoying the result of what you do, so I do enjoy my books. When I finish my books, I don't always think they're great, but when I finish my books, there is such a degree of satisfaction that they are what they are, and I hope they do well out there in the world. But I know I've put everything into them. and it's exciting. Being a writer for me is so exciting. It's a gorgeous job. So that that keeps me going. That was Shannon and Ray Piper talking with Bernadine Evaristo about her new memoir, Manifesto on Never Giving Up. So this is like the original buffet. Writing can be a political act, but so can reading, especially in a post-colonial age. Well, this Indian teak carving. Few writers know that as well as Salman Rushdie.
I was born literally 8 weeks before the end of the British Empire. There was a joke in my family which said that, Salman was born and 8 weeks later the British ran away.
Empires may crumble, but their cultural legacy lives on. As a child growing up in India, Salman Rushdie wrote the Jungle Books and the Just So stories, classics by another Anglo-Indian writer, Rudyard Kipling. The two men actually had a lot in common. Bombay childhoods, horrible British boarding schools. But politically, they could not be more different. If you look at any of his books. And yet, Rushdie does still read Kipling.
The thing is, for an Indian reader reading Kipling, you have a very double response. On the one hand, many Indian readers would agree that perhaps no Western writer knew India as deeply and as well as Rudyard Kipling did. And his writing reveals that. It reveals the depth of his knowledge. On the other hand, particularly after he went to boarding school in England and had Indophilia, if you like, beaten out of him, and came back as a little imperialist, those two things clash in Kipling all the time. And as you read him, you feel that conflict in yourself.
My favorite is the Elephant's Child.
When I was a kid, I loved the Jungle Books. Reading about Mowgli's adventures, I loved them. It was only later, as an adult, that I realized that they contained very racist tropes. The foolish monkeys in the Jungle Books are supposed to be Kipling's portrait of Indian people. When you know that stuff, it reshapes your reading.
Don't you want to just go through and open everything?
The imperialist Kipling is pretty daunting.
Yes.
He defended the British Empire everywhere, opposed home rule for Ireland. He was friends with Cecil Rhodes and Teddy Roosevelt, too, the most famous imperialists of the day.
Yep.
There's all this talk about certain writers who not only should just be read out of the canon, but basically should be canceled. And it would seem that Kipling might be a suitable candidate for that.
Yeah, I would defend him against that. It's true, there is all of that, But again, it's one of these things. I want people to read Kipling's imperialist stuff in order to understand what imperialism is like. We can't erase imperialism just because we disapprove of it. It happened, and we need to understand it.
Coming up, if you want to understand someone, there's nothing like visiting their home. So what did Steve and I find in Rudyard Kipling's house? No, I didn't hate it. No. Keep listening. It's To the Best of Our Knowledge from Wisconsin Public Radio at PRX.
Later today on This American Life, the story of a couple where he gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's, decides he wants to end his life, but the disease goes too far. She tries to help him figure out how to do that legally, which in the United States is nearly impossible. They finally find a place in Switzerland. We hear this unusually real very three-dimensional account of the entire experience they go through. It's really something. Later today.
Today at 2 on the Ideas Network.
Support for WPR comes from Wisconsin author Deborah Hufford. Her novel Blood to Rubies is about a frontier photographer caught between love and Chief Joseph's war. Blood to Rubies, in bookstores, Amazon, and DeborahHufford.com.
Support also comes from the Brick Ministries, a nonprofit organization providing emergency financial assistance for overdue bills with the focus of keeping people and their families in their homes. More is at thebrickministries.com.
90.9 WUWS, Ashland, the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. Listen online at WPR.org.
It's not often you get to sleep in a museum. But last summer, Steve and I spent a night at the Rudyard Kipling House near Brattleboro, Vermont. It's a classic turn-of-the-century country estate built in 1892 with slate roof and cedar shingles and a Kipling green. Kipling wanted it to look like one of the luxurious riverboats he'd sailed in India, so the house is long and narrow with lots of mahogany fittings. We called it Nowaka. The Landmark Trust USA owns the place now, and they rent it out. When you stay overnight, you can sit at the desk where Kipling wrote the Jungle Book, eat in his dining room, even sleep in his bedroom. So funny to look at all the books on with all the pottery. While I obsessed over the history and design, did you see the chamber pot in our bedroom? Steve was fascinated by the politics.
There are a few things you should know about Rudyard Kipling. Just over 100 years ago, he was the most popular writer in the world, and to this day, the youngest author ever to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. The second thing, he was an unabashed imperialist. Born in the heart of the British Empire in India, he wrote the notorious The White Man's Burden, which called on the U.S. to colonize the Philippines. He also wrote the beloved children's classic, The Jungle Book, set in the wilds of India. So what was he doing here? Can I just say it seems really odd that Rudyard Kipling would choose Vermont as the place to settle down?
Everything about his connection to Vermont is odd and wild, and that's when I started getting obsessed with Rudyard Kipling. The idea that that man wrote the Jungle Book right here is just too strange to believe.
Christopher Benfey is a literary scholar at Mount Holyoke College and the author of If, the Untold Story of Kipling's American Years.
So we're in the low jet.
It's a book about how Kipling, the English imperialist, fell in love with America.
I love this house to death. You know, I love everything about it. I think it's the quintessential expression of Kipling's love affair with America.
And how Americans fell in love with him.
It is a spare no expense dream house.
So let's move to this next room here.
So this is Kipling's study at the bow of the ship, at the end of the house where he could be alone, where he could look out on the beautiful rhododendron gardens. This is where the mystery happened. This is where Kipling wrote these incredible books. It's here that he wrote The Jungle Book. It's here that he wrote his American novel, Captain's Courageous. It's here that he wrote many of his greatest poems. He even began Kim. He wrote the first draft of Kim here in his Brattleboro study. So this is really it. One of the things I love in this room is a little inscription that his father left.
Kipling grew up in India and then was sent off to a British boarding school. Later, still a teenager, he went back to India to work as a journalist. He was young and ambitious when he came to America to launch his career.
As Henry James might have said, nauseatingly young. I mean, he was just incredibly precocious. This was a man who wrote The Man